We are going to begin this week with a consideration of narrative in the Hindu epics, the nature of cosmic sacrifice, and contesting the Dharma. As a reminder, in the Hindu epic, the Mahabharata, Yudhishthira is the first among the 5 Pandavas. The Pandavas are one group of individuals, brothers in the epic, that fight another group, the Kauravas. Yudhishthira was the son of King Pandu and Kuru, his first wife, Kunti, and was blessed to the couple by the god Dharma, who is often identified with the death god, Yama. In the epic, he becomes the emperor of Indraprastha and later Hastinapura. So 2 different kingdoms, Indraprastha and Hastinapura. From his childhood, Yudhishthira was greatly influenced by his uncle, Vidura, and his great-granduncle, Bhishma, and he believes in the nature of Dharma. Yudhishthira was trained in religion, science, and administration, as well as military arts by the Kuru preceptors, Kripa and Drona. Specifically, he became a master in using the spear and the war chariot. It is said that his spear was so strong that it could penetrate a stone wall as though it were a piece of paper. His chariot always flew at a 4-finger distance above the ground due to his piety. There is a period of exile in this particular epic. When the period of exile is completed, Duryodhana refused to return Yudhishthira's kingdom to him. Yudhishthira made numerous diplomatic attempts and efforts to retrieve his kingdom peacefully, but these were in vain. He was convinced then by Krishna, as an avatar of Vishnu, to wage war. The flag of Yudhishthira's chariot bore the image of the god of the moon, with planets all around it. 2 large and beautiful kettle drums called Nanda and Upananda were tied to this chariot. Before the war started, Yudhishthira stepped down from his chariot to take blessings from his grandsire, Bhishma, and also to take additional blessings from his teachers, Drona and Kripa, and from his uncle as well, Shalya. These were all on the opposite side in the war, but him taking blessings from them shows respect towards his elders. So you have this notion of respect of elders that is portrayed in that particular scene. Yudhishthira was described to be an excellent chariot warrior and this supreme master of spear fighting, as I previously mentioned, however, and you will see this come out in the scenes during the war. Yudhishthira defeats many warriors, such as Shrutriyudha and Duryodhana. He killed Madra. He killed King Shalya and his brother on the 18th and final day of the Kurukshetra war. Yudhishthira's true prowess, however, is shown in his unflinching adherence to the nature of truth, satya, and the nature of righteousness, or dharma, the word which means in this instance to uphold one's sort of ethical or moral duties. His adhering to satya and dharma were more precious to him than any sort of royal ambitions as well. They were more precious to him than material pursuits and also his family relations. During the course of the narrative, nonetheless, he rescued his 4 brothers from Yaksha by exemplifying not only his immense knowledge of Dharma and understanding of it, but also his understanding of dharmic implications. Yudhishthira's understanding of Dharma was distinct from that of other religious kings or Dhammaraj. He married Draupadi along with his 4 brothers. He had Bhima marry an outcast as well. So he also denounced this strict adherence to casteism or Varnaism, saying that a Brahmin is known by his actions, not his birth or his education in the text. So he's thus portraying that there's a changeable nature to Dharma that modifies itself to suit the times, that's not strictly adherent to notions of Varna. He was considered so pious that some sources say, as I mentioned, that he flew 4 fingers above the ground during the Kurukshetra war in his chariot and spoke truth in the hardest of circumstances. He nonetheless cheated multiple individuals to a certain extent by beating them, but he was cheated multiple times in the nature of the fighting, a more strict adherence and more simple understanding of the term cheating, by the Kauravas. So he was a king and a protector of the Dharma always, and he always felt for his subjects, is the sort of underscoring of the nature here. He even tried to avert the war between the Pandavas and the Kauravas as far as possible, but since the nature of Duryodhana kept piling up and Duryodhana's bad karma kept piling up, he was forced to fight against Duryodhana. He was nonetheless never greedy about the throne and always cared for the benefit of all beings. Even in the last battle between Bhima and Duryodhana, he promised Duryodhana that he would give him the throne if he wins in a mace fight. Nonetheless, as interpreted as a deserving person, he becomes the king after Duryodhana's death and symbolizes the victory of Dharma over adharma. He's a symbol of the victory of good over evil in that sense. Now you're reading a selection of a very important book by Emily T. Hudson this week called Disorienting Dharma, where you see Dharma as not a visible, a seen sort of essence, but an unseen or an unstabilizing sort of essence. The book makes 2 important propositions. It brings literary theory into contact with Mahabharata studies. So the sort of decades past Mahabharata studies were in one sector and literary studies, literary theory were in a sort of separate department, if you will. But in this, you're bringing them together. Additionally, the book proposes a reading focusing on a narrative theme, suffering, rather than a conceptual one. And Hudson takes on this very interesting perspective, which I like very much, and I would highlight as very important. Basically, a hermeneutics of respect seeks to listen rather than disembowel the text. So Hudson is trying to listen to the text in her interpretation of it. Literary features of the Mahabharata are of note. First of all, the epic is incredibly long, something like 7 times longer than the Odyssey and the Iliad combined. Its length is due to what many scholars identify as the epic's outstanding characteristic. It's essentially an encyclopedic narrative. The Mahabharata, in addition to being a story about the conflict between 2 sets of cousins, is also a story about literally everything else. It is in some sense a summation of the entire culture of the period. There are also many problems or sort of riddle questions in the Mahabharata that the text raises and never really conclusively resolves. And they're around essentially 2 related issues: the power of human agency and the complexities of moral life. To what extent do human beings have the freedom to make decisions and act? And to what extent are they bound like puppets on a string? This is a common motif in the Mahabharata. It forces people to think about the powers that are beyond their control. Are there forces, for example, like time and fate, that are sort of eternal, or do they not exist? The text possesses an embedded structure of stories, additionally. So why these frame stories? One story often leads to the telling of another, so that they are embedded in this sort of complex web of interlocking narratives which exist at varying points in time. The effect is simply dizzying. One often feels that they have completely lost track of where this grand scheme, the big arch of the narrative is. It's just a collection of scene after scene after scene. Further, the Mahabharata's frames are self-referential. So one scene, one story refers to another story in a completely different place in the text. And the frame of the stories tell us when, where, and by whom, and to whom a particular story was told. Thus, the audience reception is built into the design of the Mahabharata. These textual audiences are created whenever a character tells a story to another character that reveals another section of the text, layering the text on top of itself. Indeed, many of the epic stories and sub-stories and repetitions of stories are woven together in a complex weave through questions that are these sort of riddle questions. So, another question. Why the most harrowing in the world literature? Why has the text been called this? The last violent episode of the Battle of the Kurukshetra War, the Night Massacre, takes the slow, steady descent into horror to an entirely new and unprecedented level. It's incredibly violent, and it morphs into this utterly macabre series of scenes. Warriors no longer die with some modicum of dignity on the battlefield, but they're just slaughtered in their beds at night, weaponless, begging for their lives, groveling in the dirt and the sweat and the blood. And human violence here turns utterly bestial in nature, like a pack of hyenas or something like that. The Book of the Night Massacre is followed by the Book of the Women. In this, the Kaurava women visit the battlefield after the war, and they behold this terrible carnage. The audience who might see this performance witnesses the women gasp and shriek and wail and drop to the earth as they happen upon the severed heads, the partial limbs, the insides of their husbands, brothers, and fathers just strewn across the dirt. Or as they see the ghouls and the beasts of prey feasting upon the corpses of their loved ones. It's a terrible scene. The Mahabharata perennially delivers these sort of sucker punches one after another, layering them into the text, building up to those last two books. It's a series of crippling blows to the readership that rips one's comforting blinders away and then leaves them with the nature of the sort of understanding of just like the worst of human nature. It's very revealing in that sense. Just punch after punch, and then the utterly like worst aspects of human nature come out at the very end. So it's interesting when people sort of think about Hinduism as like, oh, it's this peaceful religion. When it gets into this absolutely terribly violent aspects that are portrayed in this text, you start to ask, well, is it? Hudson suggests that the true understanding of the Mahabharata is conveyed through the aesthetics of suffering, the term in Sanskrit here being dukkha. So there are five sort of principles that are used to convey these aesthetics. The concept of suffering itself, the nature of dukkha, both as a central theme and as an aesthetic principle. It's just everything is dukkha, 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 dukkha. Then you have the narrative strategies, the layering of the text. One sucker punch, another sucker punch, a third sucker punch, over and over again. Then you have the nature of the reader, the sensitive reader, the receiver, the sartahya. Then you have the characters who are fascinating sort of creatures and deities and gods just layered on top of one another, and these sort of tragic hero figures that you just can't help being interested in. Then you also have the sort of religious and cosmological categories that are used in the text that are constructed to convey certain themes. So this would be like the nature of dukkha, and then also the relationship between dharma and dukkha. So this is the essential argument that Hudson is making, that there is a relationship between the nature of suffering and the nature of dharma.